Welcome everybody. Welcome to the fifth session of the Africana Muslim and Genealogies of White Supremacy Sawyer Seminar for the Interdisciplinary Study of Blackness and Muslimness. The seminar is led by Professors Suad Abdul Kabir, Murad Idris, and myself, Samer Ali. The seminar focuses on the racialized figure of the Africana Muslim, i.e., Muslims from Africa and its diaspora. Its main aim is to address the way the Africana Muslim has been hypervisible. Hypervisible in the theory and practice of racism since the days of Columbus, yet at the same time largely invisible in scholarship on critical race studies, white supremacy, and Middle East studies. The seminar brings together leading scholars, thinkers, activists to reconceptualize the study of the African and the Muslim and recenter the Africana Muslim beyond the cracks of traditional disciplines and narratives. Our goal is to trace the intersection of race and religion in the production and reproduction of white supremacy in both theory and practice. The seminar is supported by the Mellon Foundation and housed at our home institution, the University of Michigan, whose origins are a land grant from the Anishinaabe, including the Odawa, the Ojibwa, and the Potawatomi, and the Wyandot. Our university stands, like almost all property in the United States, on lands obtained in unconscionable ways from indigenous peoples. Knowing where we are changes neither the past nor the present. However, through the scholarship and pedagogy, we work to create a future in which the past is thoroughly understood and the present supports human flourishing and justice while enacting an ethic of care and compassion. Today's session is theory. It is the culminating keynote lecture to a series of discussions aiming to generate a wide-ranging reflection on these questions and themes in relation to theory. Theoretical production is entwined with histories, structures, and ideas that are either explicitly anchored in the racialization of Muslims or implicitly in their elision. We gather to ask how these dynamics help us account for race and religion across disciplines. How does rethinking the Africana Muslim in historical and contemporary bodies of theory-based knowledge challenge dominant assumptions? This panel series shines a different light onto questions of epistemology, history, and intellectual authority. Today's panel instigates a conversation about the Africana Muslim in relation to theory, placing the Africana Muslim at the center of race and religion as problems of theory. This conceptual shift reflects a broader movement across disciplines the past 20 years, and it indexes the transformative power of that ongoing intellectual labor. This is a transdisciplinary movement that has addressed problems of power, periodization, and the different permutations of key concepts ranging from resistance to alternatives to contemporary political and economic forms, and to the history and to the horizons of possible futures. That trend has made a place for theorizing the place of theory itself, or interrogating what kind of insight counts as theory, what kind of subject can be a theorist, and what activists excluded from the category of theorizing can tell us. These are, at their core, questions about theory and authority, and how religion, race, ethnicity, gender, class, and predetermined themes have all gone into constructing theory. What counts as theory is a question that has been with us in the last few sessions in the background, whether when we addressed the place of prisons and freedom, plantations and identity, law and autonomy, media and representation, or the dominant histories and their trajectories. These all, in a sense, are questions of theory as an act of authorizing of self-authorization of authority. These are not just abstract academic or historical questions, but ones that had direct and quite dire implications for institutions, imaginations, and life. Critical inquiry itself, I'm sorry, critical inquiry, its sites, and its scholars are once again under attack. This moment continues the long history of white supremacist ideologies that have marked Blackness and Muslimness as other and as vulnerable to state authority, violence, and suppression. It also continues a long history of critical intellectual production and perhaps theorizing that speaks to the even more pressing need to continue the work of envisioning and working toward a world where those most vulnerable among us can flourish. We come together recognizing that today's conversation will take us across time and space, but are intimately connected to the crisis of authority we find ourselves in today. Our keynote speaker today is Dahlia E.M. Gubara. She is assistant professor of history at Koç University, Istanbul, bridging the fields of Islamic and European intellectual history. Her work is principally concerned with the production and transmission of knowledge in and about the Islamic tradition and is regionally focused on the Middle East and Africa. Her work has appeared in the Journal of Arabic Literature, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, among other places. She is completing a book manuscript entitled The Impossible University, Al-Azhar Between Islamic Tradition and Colonial Modernity, and has begun a long-term project tracing the many lives of Luqman al-Hakim in Islamic tradition and beyond. Please join me in welcoming Professor Gubara.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Samir. Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you very much for this very generous invitation. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here and to deliver this lecture amongst you, even if it is virtual. I want to thank Suad, Murad, and Samir for this important initiative, and Marissa and now Iman for their patience and grace in taking care of all the planning. I'm also enormously grateful for this opportunity to rethink and articulate again some of the issues that I have been trying to address in my work for some time now, about a decade, but don't tell anyone. Indeed, much of what I will present is not really new. My lecture consists largely of arguments that I and others have been making for a long time now. And that in itself, I think, merits some serious attention and reflection. And this is kind of the angle that I wanted to take this lecture in. The question is, why do these paradigms and reflexes concerning the study of race in Islam persist despite repeated, seemingly irreparable critique? And my sense, as you can no doubt imagine, is that this answer has something to do largely with ideology. It's ideological, not in a conspiratorial, but in a biopolitical manner. It continues to serve particular structures of power to incite a discourse on race in Islam, and especially in the so-called Afro-Arab rather, borderlands. So there is little possibility of this chatter ending anytime soon. Now, this is, of course, also a self-critique, a reminder of sorts that even critical discourse still partakes in some form of incitement. As Michael Tausig has written, quote, critique sustained in conventional terms sustains conventions, end quote. The objective then is not merely to engage in critique, but to explore and subvert the determining conventions according to which it is done. And indeed, to move beyond that to the difficult work of trying to construct alternative conceptual grammars and frames of analysis. Now, the format of my lecture then might sound somewhat preachy, even pedantic, but it's not meant to be that at all. My starting point is simply that scholarship is active and activism is predicated on discourse. Now, this point seems obvious, but it's worth reminding. History can never be just an antiquated pursuit or intellectual curiosity. The narratives that we weave have real life bearings and emanate wittingly or unwittingly from one's individual lived and intellectual experience. My reflections here then are very much shaped by the testing times that Samir alluded to in his introduction, that we all currently inhabit across the globe. But it's also a rather personal story for me, as should be clear enough. And these, sorry, as should be clear enough. And these are Oh, okay. And these injunctions are ones that I seek to apply first and foremost in my own scholarship. For indeed, I speak from a position of ambivalence, unease, even ambiguity. Highly conscious of my own racialized subjectivity, I also inhabit a faith and a tradition that is perhaps unparalleled in its all-embracing universality, including explicitly some people who are racialized like me, beginning with the Abyssinian Bilal of Islamic lore, who might have looked a little like me even, to be honest. But I'm also equally mindful of my variable familial heritage, which included slave owning practices of both quote unquote white and quote unquote black slaves, to use today's parlance. So the title of my lecture is How Not to Study Race in Islam. This is, of course, in reference to Joseph Mas'ad's short piece in Arabic entitled كيف يجب ألا ندرس النوع الاجتماعي or الجندر في العالم العربي. How not to study gender in the Arab world. The piece has stimulated much of my arguments, along with Mas'ad's larger critique of the conventions according to which gender and sexuality are approached in Arab history. And this despite and beyond the danger of participating in the incitement to discourse. Mas'ad speaks directly about this in the opening pages of his now classic Desiring Arabs, and I'll say a little bit more in a minute about what this incitement to discourse is, just in case people aren't totally clear about it. So let me say first that no single lecture can address the complicated layers of critique and counter-critique that animate the study of race in Islamic tradition. What is needed is a sustained conversation in important forums such as this one, because it seems to me that that is where interesting and significant things can happen, much more so than in sophisticated arguments and erudite tracks. What we need is debate, candid discussion, and the creativity required to explicate other vernaculars, theoretical arsenals, and methodologies for talking about the construction of difference outside of the conscripts of Euro-American orders of knowledge that stubbornly endure. So let me begin first by outlining some aspects of the historiographical and conceptual apparatuses that, in my view, mitigate any kind of analysis of difference and subjectivity in Islamic tradition. And here, forgive me, but I will draw directly on previous work, published work, as well as forthcoming work, and also in quite heavy measure on the work of Talal Asad, which influences my approach and understanding to Islam. So my doctoral work, way back when, was on Al-Azhar and the orders of knowledge in the 18th and 19th century. And it centered on questions around modes of knowing and being in the Islamic tradition. Principally the notion of the self, its production, disciplining, and ownership or lack thereof, and more crucially, its non-translatability into the modern conceptual grammars of the autonomous individual. Now, this research began as a set of brief, even fleeting questions on the relationship between the concepts of race and civilization and the epistemological strictures of modern historical writing. But in due course, it blossomed into a broader research agenda that begins by asking whether it is indeed possible to study race and slavery, in my case, outside of Europe, and what would be the value of such a study. Now, in order to begin, To suggest responses to these questions, it is obvious that we must engage first in a critical genealogy of concepts, precisely because words, things, and people are always mutually imbricated by a multiplicity of relations. The attention to genealogical concepts was launched already a long time ago by the towering contributions of course, Michel Foucault, but also Anthony Grafton in European intellectual history, Edward Said and Talal Asad in Edward Said in literary studies, Talal Asad in anthropology, and Valentin Mudimbe, to name just a few. And it has continued in the careful and nuanced work of a generation of scholars since, notwithstanding the vehement critique that's been hurled against it. The common point in all of these interventions is to think through fundamental concepts of scholarship, such as religion and, of course, race, but also secularism, power, agency, writing, texts, education, citizen, sexuality, etc., and particularly as they cross into different discursive traditions. How to think through them in ways that are both critical but also fresh and new. And the consensus has been that the colonial encounter is constitutive of the modern conceptual palette, and that alternative constellations are well worth the effort to engage. For the purposes of our discussion here, this centers on two very distinct spatial and scholarly regimes, Islam and Africa. Okay. All right. Now, I tackle some of these questions through two complementary paths. In a piece entitled Revisiting Race and Slavery through Abdulrahman al-Jabarti's Ajaib al-Athar, I interrogate conceptions of race, slavery, and freedom in the growing literature on what is often termed Arab Islamic slavery, or AIS for short. Through a close reading of a seminal 18th to early 19th century text from Ottoman Cairo. I suggest here that the thematic contours of AIS discourse, right, of the body of literature on what has been called Arab Islamic slavery, indicates that we're faced with an incitement to racial discourse, very much akin to the phenomena that was identified by Foucault concerning Victorian sexuality. The unprecedented compulsion of which AIS scholars unabashedly partake, incidentally, almost every single contribution in this scholarship begins with some kind of lament about this hasn't been written about enough, we need to say more about this, this topic is taboo, etc. The unprecedented compulsion to address the subject of race and its various colors, slavery, color prejudice, discrimination, minorities, etc., in the last half century or so, coupled with the suggestion that the theme is somehow taboo, that it is censored, it is repressed, operates in this very same manner. It assumes and incites the idea that race is in some way an essential object, unchanging over time and space, eternal and universal, and most importantly, that it must be talked about. This, coupled with the imposition of clear-cut, immutable identities on people who may not have identified as so, and is informed, sorry, I lost my line here, who may not have so identified, extends to and is informed by the present. And much like in the case of the discourse on Arab sexuality that Mas'ad discusses, the cognitive violence involved is significant, and the self-confidence of the scholar to ascribe identities as and where he sees fit is astonishing. We can thus discern a coherent story in this body of literature, I argue. The plot is one of condemnation, redemption, and heroism. Condemnation of the perpetrators, redemption of their hapless victims and their muted invisibility, and celebration of the heroism of the scholar activist. The foregrounding of the valiant role of the scholar is palpable throughout the many interventions in the field and is repeated, and the repeated evocation of the taboo, a discursive maneuver that Foucault slices through mercilessly when he suggests to call it the speaker's benefit. Foucault writes, quote, "If sex is repressed, that is condemned to prohibition, non-existence and silence, Then, the mere fact that one is speaking about it has the appearance of a deliberate transgression. It somehow anticipates the coming of freedom, end quote. And like any story, in this literature on Arab Islamic slavery, we can identify recognizable protagonists. The mature, autonomous, self-owning liberal or Christo-secular Kantian subject. The Muslim Arab religious subject, for whom slavery is, to quote John Hunwick, one of the leading figures in this field, part of the God-given order of things. And finally, the Black African victim subject, muted, invisible, and destined to be saved in these narratives of redemption and seeking above all to reclaim their agency in this historical drama. Now, by contrast, when searching for race and slavery in Jabarti's work, so Jabarti's text is, Jabarti discusses and notes the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte, which is identified as the beginning of modernity in the Middle East. So obviously a problematic contention, but I won't go into it here. So 1798, essentially. And Jabarti witnessed this. So his text is particularly important because it's seen as being precisely at this cusp of the modern. And what's striking when one looks at this text, you're immediately confounded by the absence of any fixed dichotomies of white versus black, freedom versus unfreedom, Arab versus African, etc. Instead, the text bespeaks of an array of skin colors and identities that simply do not correspond to our notions of race or civilization, and to a multiplicity of relations of dependence and authority that bound the individual to others in variable and changing ways. There is no room, in other words, for the autonomous individual, the ubiquitous subject of modern law and capitalism. Just as people did not constitute a generic entity in a Jabarti's world, neither did the free and the slave. The organizing principle of norms was social harmony under the sort of all-encompassing framework of the Sharia and the ethical cultivation of the self. Not surprisingly, then, these two themes permeate a Jabarti's text. Similarly, in place of a distinct category, Africa or African, of modern vernacular, one finds there an assortment of identity markers, references to Zenj, Sudan, Ahbash, Nuba, Barabira, Takarina, etc. Right? And a multitude of skin colors, including blue and green and wheat-colored and so blonde and so on. There is no reference to a unitary Africa, whether Black or not, quite simply because there is no place for a continentalist vision in a Jabarti's world. The continent was rather composed of multiple regions, provinces, and places that varied in nature, size, and regularity, none of which followed the contours of what the contemporary term Africa allows. In another piece entitled Muhammad al-Kashnawi and the Everyday Life of the Occult, I contrast the life and works of this 18th century peripatetic polymath who was born in today's northern Nigeria, Muhammad al-Kashnawi, and who spent much time in the Hijaz and in Egypt, with contemporary assumptions concerning the division between Arab and African Muslims, but also between what is considered occult or real science. Now, my conclusion there was that rather than conforming, and I'll just read it here, it's easier than trying to explain it all. Rather than conforming to the conventional contours delineated by the dualities of Africa or Islam, center, periphery, occult, and science, heterodox or orthodox, my reading of al-Kashnawi's text reveals instead a thoroughly integrated world of scholarship, where so-called Africans and Arabs and many others rubbed shoulders continuously, and where the domains of the occult were not barricaded from other sciences, but rather partook in a wider epistemic cosmos, grounded in what we can call an embodied ethics of learning. Indeed, what is most striking is the extent to which al-Kashnawi's framing of his work resembles the epistemic contours of many other disciplines, fields, and texts in the tradition. Knowledge, then, for al-Kashnawi and those of his time is understood first and foremost as an everyday lived practice. Its seeker displays an almost physical proximity to the subject matter. Its focus is on ends and outcomes, not just truth. Its transmission is articulated to a relational, interpersonal system of validation that is intended to guarantee its integrity. End quote. Now, scholarly discussions on the occult in the Islamic tradition, and of al-Kashnawi in particular, have determined his place in the literature as one that is marked by a dual marginalization. That of Africa from Islam's central Arab heartland, and of magic from the orthodox, proper realms of scholarship. And for this, we have to thank the pioneers of the field of study, variously known as Islam in Africa or African Islam. Now, though it's often made to go back to Arab geographers of the classical period, this is evidently an anachronism because those authors, these much medieval Arab geographers, had neither a formulated conception of something called Islam nor of something called Africa, let alone their conjugation. More relevant are the writings of European explorers, missionaries, colonial officers, come scholars, such as J. Spencer Trinningham, one of the godfathers of this field, who in aggregate assembled what Mudimbe has described as the colonial library, through which Africa was invented as a coherent geographical space, where competing external monotheisms penetrated the fabric of traditional, primitive, pagan host societies. The conceptual topography here is based on the existence of an indigenous African substratum that can be delineated through geographic, linguistic, racial, and sometimes cultural criteria, reeling underneath the forceful weight of a globalizing, aggressive Islamic superstructure. Now, it is this logic that sustains claims of Islam's, quote, penetration into African societies and, quote, its introduction of foreign concepts into particularist, animist settings. Accordingly, African societies can only be nominally Muslim, local factors having determined the syncretic character of the religion. Ergo, Islam in Africa must be understood as a unique phenomenon, one to be studied according to its own internal logics and structures and forms, amongst which is its characteristic marginality. The most enduring effect of this framework's corroboration of an insider-outsider center-periphery logic has been the idea of the superficiality of Islamization in Africa, as I just said. And that is precisely the domains, or let's say the kind of theoretical apparatus that constrains any kind of lucid study of al-Kashnawi or any other scholar of this time. Okay, so in the remaining time that I have, I just want to outline a set of broad propositions to kind of begin to open up a discussion. And again, forgive me for sounding a bit preachy about this. I don't mean to, but it's the only way I could kind of formulate them in my head. So one, search not for meaning, but for use, to echo the late Wittgenstein. There is no such thing as an unchanging, essential Islamic understanding of race. There are instead various Islamic practices, practices inspired and justified through the Islamic tradition that constitute historically determined racial formations. As historians, then, and speaking to myself, we must restrict ourselves to analyzing particular configurations of identity and difference, which are always constituted by multiple continuities and ruptures that triangulate the present with a legitimizing past and an anticipated future. Now, this might seem self-evident, but it's not. In large part, due to the heavy legacy of the discipline of Orientalism on scholarship, which, as Edward Said has demonstrated, saw Islam as a cultural synthesis that could be studied apart from the economics, sociology, and politics of Islamic peoples. The call here extends beyond simple contextualization and was taken up by anthropologist Talal Asad in his seminal 1986 essay on the idea of an anthropology of Islam, and developed later in subsequent writings. Asad famously asserted that if one seeks to study Islam, one should begin as Muslims do, from the concept of a discursive tradition that includes and relates itself to the founding texts of the Quran and the Hadith. end quote. Islam, then, following Asad, is best understood not as a culture, a dogma, or a fixed set of rituals. It is in the formulation of a tradition, a way of life, to which argument and change are integral and internal. To the question, what is tradition? Asad answers, a tradition consists essentially of discourses that seek to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice, that precisely because it is established has a history. An Islamic discursive tradition, then, is simply a tradition of Muslim discourse that addresses itself to conceptions of the Islamic past and future, with reference to a particular Islamic practice in the present. He continues, clearly not everything Muslims say and do belongs to an Islamic discursive tradition, nor is an Islamic tradition in this sense necessarily imitative of what was done in the past. For even where traditional practices appear to the anthropologist to be imitative of what has gone before, it will be the practitioner's conceptions of what is apt performance on of how the past is related to present practices that will be crucial for tradition, not the apparent repetition of an old form. End quote. So what does this mean for us in methodological terms, or for me particularly, how have I kind of understood this in my practice as a historian? It means that what ought to be explored is not the behaviors of Muslims as dramatis personae, and how these belong to one social blueprint or another, but rather the way that discursive power operates to regulate correct practices, and how these are exercised, and the conditions that make them possible, social, political, economic, etc., as well as the resistances that they encounter. That one ought to read and listen closely to the historical sources and the actors themselves, not to interpret them as per our own understanding of what is or is not Islamic, but to learn from them as active agents in a wider dialogical conversation. It follows that Islam in its essence, whatever that may mean, cannot be said to condone or condemn racecraft. It provides certain references and tools that permit particular positions and ways of life, which are never fixed, but are negotiated through argument and debate. So, for example, where one source might formulate an argument that sounds racist or racializing to us, think, for example, Ahmed Baba's famous track on slavery, another may respond with a seemingly non-racist argument when articulating its own conception of notions of difference. Now, of course, neither can be said to be more Islamic or less Islamic than the other. The position that will become dominant will do so not because of its greater authenticity, but because of a variety of other factors and relations of power, only one of which is the formal reasonableness of the argument. 2, to not take references to the terms Africa or African for granted, but to continually scrutinize how they are mobilized in both the sources and in scholarship. Now, as alluded to above, the idea of Africa, which we have inherited from the 19th century and beyond, was produced alongside Orientalism, and it mirrored that of the mainly Arab Islamic Orient. Non-scriptural, mainly oral and largely acephalous African cultures, were conceived as objects to be analyzed through the discipline of natural history or anthropology. Now, we might recall here Hegel's famous designation of Africa proper, Africa south of the Sahara, that is, as being barely on the threshold of world history. Marked in particular by Christian tropes of a lost paradise and the ideal state of nature, the study of Africa produces its object as separate and inferior to, but ultimately more salvageable than Islam and the Orient. The noble savage of the Dark Continent was childish, shameless, vulnerable, and irrational. Winston Churchill succinctly expressed this when he described the people of what is now the Republic of Sudan as a, quote, mongrel mixture of the Arab and Negro types, producing a debased and cruel breed, more shocking because they are more intelligent than the primitive savages, end quote. Another great scholarly pioneer here is Maurice de la Fosse, who crossed over from Orientalism to ethnology in a concerted effort to produce a distinct Africanist discipline with a theoretical canon and scientific method all of its own. One late 20th century analyst puts it well when he writes, De La Fosse was neither a negrophobe nor a negrophile. He was a negrologue. And this is precisely the point. Like the Islam of Orientalist scholarship, what is involved was the creation of Africa as a discrete, coherent, and authentic object of scientific analysis. An Africa that had an indigenous essence, a spirit or soul that could be defined, analyzed, domesticated, and ultimately controlled. It's not a question of liking or hating Islam or Africa, but of studying them precisely as fixed naturalized entities under the all-knowing gaze of the scholar. But this is, of course, a wild European fantasy. The continent was composed throughout time by multiple worlds, all interrelated, and also thoroughly integrated with other worlds beyond. And its history has been extraordinarily rich and dynamic. To take a simple but profound example, and a particularly relevant one for this seminar, perhaps, the history of the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant is unthinkable if abstracted from its connection to Africa. A well-known illustration should suffice. Connections between the Arab and African shores feature prominently in the history of the Red Sea, as Alexis Wick has shown in his work, from the beginning of recorded time. And when the early Muslim believers sought refuge from the persecution of the Meccan elite, they fled to no other than Ethiopia, a meaningful gesture of familiarity and trust. Then, when the Meccan authorities attempted to force the return of the exiles, they sent a delegation to the Najus or the Negus, composed of important personalities, Arabian personalities, who were born to African mothers. In practical terms, this means that we should never reify historical identities or assume boundaries of belonging and foreignness that we now take for granted, rightly or wrongly. For example, when Al-Kashnawi writes in his text Ad-Durr al-Manzoom, quote, and the translation here is my own, I find that in most cases in these lands, they don't like anyone, especially if he be of our people, the Sudanese, min jinsuna Sudaniyin, unless they seek to benefit from him without any true affection or care, etc. What is indicated are his feelings of solitude in the Hijaz, his longing for his home, a rhetoric that points to the predicament of the pilgrim, the mujawir, and that does not automatically translate into evidence of an African identity alienated in the Arab world, or of racialist thinking implying a systematic contempt on the part of Arabs towards Black Africans, as some scholars have suggested. Samir, how much time do I have, just so I don't lose track here? I can't hear you.
About another minute or two.
Okay. Let me run through this then. If it's okay with you, I'll take 5. That's all right.
Okay.
3, to resist despite all the empirical evidence and all the obvious shortcuts, the temptation to think of race as something observable rather than a highly fungible ideological concept. In this regard, black and white or any other reference to skin color should be thought of as strictly equivalent to Semite and Aryan. Enormously potent, obviously, to the point of legitimizing the US one-drop rule and the Holocaust, but highly variable and never instantly visible or recognizable. What is black or white in one place or time might not be so in another time. And this was something that, of course, we learn from historian Barbara Fields, who taught us already a very long time ago that part of the problem here is the understanding of race as something that is observable, a thing, rather than something that is ideological. I won't read the whole quote. Perhaps a few personal anecdotes can illustrate this a bit more clearly, if rather naively. When I first arrived in New York for my graduate studies, I stumbled on a demonstration on campus for peace in Darfur. So I approached them and I expressed my solidarity. And when one of the organizers of the protest heard that I was from Sudan, she hugged me with lamentations about my suffering and concern about my relatives back home. My skin color here signified an oppressed African as opposed to the oppressor, the Arab. She was not impressed when I revealed that I was in fact from Khartoum and born to a family claiming a genealogy that goes all the way back to Yemen. In Ramallah, Palestine, I was teased by young boys in the main square of the city, El Manara, with cries of Ariha, Ariha, the Arabic name for the city of Jericho, whose native population is often of a significantly darker hue than elsewhere in the country. Here, my skin color signified an indigenous marker of difference in a land with very strong regional urban identities. In the African communities near Al-Aqsa Mosque, by contrast, my appearance evoked a common Sahelian heritage of Muslim piety. In Beirut, predictably, I was marked in terms of local class landscapes, usually assumed to be a domestic worker, and the word used in Lebanon here is Sri Lankan, in local parlance. Whereas in Istanbul, my sartorial and linguistic attire clearly trumped my skin color. I am a foreign, middle class, tourist, professor, etc. Again, the idea is to avoid reifying any stable notions of identity. 4, to similarly reject any totalizing idea of Islam or Blackness. I've already kind of gone into this in some detail, so I think I'll just skip that for now. Only to say that again, the effort to unlock these genealogies is incredibly important, because without them, we can't begin to understand that the way that language operates to authorize forms of life and certain kinds of world, how they construct them, but also, as Atiya Hussein has cogently pointed out in the last seminar, obscure them too. 5, to not dismiss the universalist claims of Islam, even when they seem to be contradicted by whatever evidence we may find. There is obviously a reason for Islam's constant growth across the centuries, including amongst quote unquote Blacks. Its universalizing claims of a tradition are central. The fact that Blacks converted to Islam in one situation or another should be unsurprising. Dare I say, even unimportant. What matters to the analyst is the possibility to integrate into the tradition and to renegotiate its boundaries. In this sense, the very idea of an Islam noir or an African Islam is nonsensical. Beyond the flawed racial and continental frames, there can only be one Islam, as a contested and dynamic tradition that has at its heart a self-consciously universalizing set of texts. Now, 6, and I'll just read them very quickly, to refuse any apologetic propaganda and never ignore internal breaches to the universalist claims of Islam. Right? The critique to racism and Islamophobia should obviously not obscure sober and critical analyses of the tradition. In fact, criticism of the tradition, especially by those of us invested in it as a way of life. Of course, different audiences and genres elicit different discourses and positions. A Friday khutbah in a friendly setting on the ground is not the same as a scholarly article written in the Euro-American Academy. But we should be able to adopt this pattern of speech, like everybody else, without having to justify ourselves of double speak. Still, a tradition that has no internal critique is a dying tradition, and we should always keep this in mind. Finally, 7, to avoid focusing on exclusive definitions. And by this, I mean to be sensitive to the articulations of different conceptions of race, religion, gender, class, etc., and their intersectionality. This is famously true. And their intersectionality. Gender and class, of course, intersect with race on multiple planes and across various terrains. But an enormously important element of the modern order of knowledge is the racialization of religion and how we ought to extricate one from the other. This is famously true about Judaism in the 19th century, of course, with devastating consequences such as the Holocaust and Zionism, but it is also crucially true in the case of Muslims, who have been racialized throughout time in profound, if different ways. By conclusion, let me say that the point of this exploration ultimately is to let ourselves be taken and shaken by other settings. The challenge is to face these various claims not as inferior or outdated versions of ourselves, but as different. And I'll end there. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much,
Th
Dahlia. Thank you so much, Dahlia, for a really perceptive and thoughtful. You've given us so much to chew on. I will now hand this over to Iman, who will take care of the questions and answers.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. That presentation was so lucid, so incredible, and I just want to encourage everyone, if you have any questions, to please put them in the Q&A format. But I guess I'll start with a question of my own and just say, as a graduate student who has been in Islamic theology and philosophy courses, reading texts, reading texts and seeing mentions and instances of race, whether it be, I remember being in a class and reading Ibn Taymiyyah and there being a derogatory statement made about Black women and loving Black women, and being told in that class that to not bring in that I can't see that statement for what it is because race didn't exist then, and that that would be me bringing in my own kind of modern perceptions into the text. I just feel so grateful for the framework that you've given us of how to think and how not to think, and the way that we can be done and undone and think with these texts and source. And I have a question, and I was really interested in the way that you brought in Barbara and Karen Fields and drawing on critical race theory and even your own kind of Black feminist practice. What I would name a Black feminist practice of bringing in your own lived experience of how how you've been read in different contexts, and to just explore the the very like fluid understandings of race. So I was wondering what possibilities you see in your work also brought to mind in terms of thinking about fungibility. Zakiya Iman Jackson. I just thought so much about how this is like this thinking about race is it is speaks, I feel like, so much to Black feminist theory and whatnot. So I was wondering what possibilities you see like with bringing these fields together, in terms of thinking about like Islamic theology and philosophy and just the discursive tradition, and also thinking about Black feminist thought in these ways as being really helpful. Yeah.
Thanks, Iman. That's a good question, and a difficult question in some sense, because part of the difficulty is part of the difficulty I deal with a lot in my work is how do you maintain or how do you balance this particularity of the Islamic tradition as a tradition, right? One that can contain within it diversity, but also unity in some sense. And how do you cross over to think with different bodies of theory, and to have them bear on it without it, in some sense, what's the word I'm looking for? Miscoloring, or, not necessarily speaking to the authenticity of the tradition. So I think this is a really, really difficult question. In my case, I feel that I can benefit from reading these other theoretical frameworks to see what kind of methodological and interrogatory approaches they take, but to not necessarily take that theory and map it onto Islamic tradition. I think that does a certain amount of violence to the tradition. And here's where I heed Talal very, very seriously. If one wants to study Islam, one must begin the way Muslims do, right? So for me, that's absolutely critical. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say about it, because I think we have to work with very specific examples and issues rather than in this very broad sense. Can we find a voice for a specific issue within the Islamic tradition? Yes. can we just argue that different theoretical bodies of knowledge can easily move? I don't think so. I think it's careful. It's a bit of a
Mm, mm.
convoluted answer, but do you see what I'm trying to say?
I do, I do. I hear and see what you're trying to say. Absolutely.
Yeah.
If no one else has a question, I would love to. Oh, let's see, we've got one. Um, let's see. A question is asking, instead of thinking about race, shouldn't we study the process of racialization, which is not fixed? Can you comment on this?
Yes. Yes, I think so. Um, but also in studying the process of racialization still assumes at its heart the concept of race, right?
Mm,
It's you have to start with dismantling that concept in some sense. The fact that a lot of the languages of the Islamic world don't actually really have a word for it, I think is also quite revealing and telling. And so, yes, we can use racialization definitely when talking about it, but I think that doesn't sort of permit us to not interrogate the concept of race that is at the heart of it.
mm. Thank you. A question I had is I would be really interested to hear from you what the reception of your work in this framework and your articles has been in the field, because I think we just knowing how intense these debates and
Yeah.
sticky and a whole bunch of different you know descriptive words have been. I would just be so curious about what how it's been received.
Uh, Again, it depends where, right? So when I
Yeah.
first gave what became my article on race and slavery, the first venue where I gave it was Columbia University in New York.
Mm,
And while sort of a lot of the researchers there were sort of, liked it and said positive things about it, I got a lot of pushback from African American students, big time.
mm,
There was this sense of what they saw on my part as a form of betrayal
mm,
of the cause, a certain apologetic for Arabs, and so on. So there, in that context, you have one notion of what Blackness means, right? Pushing against others. When I gave it in Kampala, in Uganda, most of the students at Makerere University, most of the students there were like, so what? Why do we need to hear all this, right? I mean, it
mm,
wasn't even something that they considered to be of any interest, frankly.
mm,
Their issue was with white colonialism. That's what
mm,
they want to talk about. That's what, African underdevelopment, those are the kind of things that they wanted to discuss, and how race plays into that, and not some kind of old history of Arabs and Africans and slavery. When I gave it in Beirut, I got a very defensive reaction from a mostly Lebanese audience, because they saw this as yet another attack on Arabness and Muslimness and so on. So the experiences of that are what kind of led to my trying to think about, okay, how do we do this? How do we create a space to have this critique, but at the same time to not efface various concerns of readers across different contexts,
mm.
um, and how they understand their issues.
Really fascinating. Thank you. Samir, do you want to answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Dahlia. You've given me so much to think about, and I've struggled with many of the questions that you have worked on. And you're kind of way ahead of got my game. So I have a few questions for you. I have been very reluctant to think of groupings that come up in Arabic sources like Zenj or Sud or Yahud even um, as race. So and I can see sometimes that there are characteristics that are associated with that grouping. And I'm super cautious because precisely for the same reasons that you bring up, that we're talking about an ideology. And,
Mm,
race has been called a superstition, it's been called a religion, it's been called a fiction. as opposed to a physical fact or a even an inherent kind of social marker. Um, and and so I'm wondering how do how at what I'm wondering where you are in your thinking. Like, I'm wondering if there are specific circumstances where you have like a series of characteristics or a series of criteria that are met where you're like, yes, going back to your quote of Wittgenstein, the usage, where the usage looks like yes, they're talking about a race. It's not just a grouping, the way that we would talk about, say, a profession as a grouping or, from a certain city as a grouping. Um, I'm wondering like where you are and what are those criteria where you get to the point where a particular author or a particular source in that usage does feel like they're talking about a race.
Um, so I've come across various things that strike me as race, right?
Mhm.
Or that you kind of intuitively think of as race. But what I've found is that as I start to read more in that text, so let's take, for example, a Jabarti, there's a
Mhm.
lot of instances where he's talking about this person being beautiful because they're light-skinned and things like that, where you can begin to think, oh, this sounds like a racial kind of situation. But
Mhm.
then when I take the text as a whole, and I start to read the text for its rhetorical value, and I start to do exercises of reading that go beyond just kind of finding passages that speak to us, to our framework. It starts to get really, really confusing and messy. So, in short, I haven't yet found a scholar that I can say is has a concept, a clear theoretical notion
Mhm.
of something called race. And my question is, why do we need it? And this goes as well for the
Mhm.
European tradition. So this is not just some kind of apologetic for non-Europe, right? The same goes for the European tradition. Why do we need it? The subversive aspect of race, this mass subjugation of peoples, totalizing mass subjugation of peoples, is a very modern thing. It doesn't, I don't know of it
Mhm.
in pre-modern traditions, just quite simply. I know of notions of prejudice and difference and language that can sound racial.
Mhm.
But I wouldn't call it race in that way, you know.
I mean, where I have seen, I mean, in the European tradition, going back to, the Pliny and Herodotus and some of
Mm,
them, they have basically what amount to racial profiles of different cultures when they're talking about different cultures, different peoples. They're assembling what they call what ends up being called
probably,
um, mirabilia, marvelous races or marvelous people, and then monstrous ones. So there's the marvelous and the monstrous, and that comes into medieval Europe, especially with the Crusade, and you see on there's the entrance of Vézelay Abbey in France. There's a depiction of the Pentecost where there are monstrous races, the people of the world. Among them are Muslims and Jews and Hindus and African pygmies, and they're all caricatured, physically caricatured to accentuate. And and I mean, I see those as racial profiles and races that are. It's not a system of racism per se, but it is definitely a step um, toward. I mean, you have physiognomies, and you have a step toward a hierarchy of races, and so I'm But I've never seen anything like that in sources that are Arabic. I don't have access to, all the Islamic languages, but in the sources that I've seen, I haven't seen those kinds of monstrous or marvelous depictions in travel literature. So I like you. I've been very I haven't run across it, and I've been very cautious to kind of take a look at what I'm looking at.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at ilm al-firasa, what they call ilm al-firasa, right? The
Yeah,
science of
right.
theology, and you see it spilling into literary texts like Kitab al-Aghani and stuff like that. Yes, I mean, they also rank almost like they say at the
Mm,
top is this, and then this, and then
mm,
this,
mm,
and then this, But then somebody who will make reference to that text in the next generation will flip the order. And so
mm.
there's an inconsistency
Yeah, yeah,
in it, like you identified.
yeah,
And no one is fully monstrous and no one is fully beautiful
right.
either, right? So
Yeah.
yes, I think you're right in saying that. But again, I think so I keep shifting in my reading of critical race theory, like what is this thing called race? Like, do we understand this as something structural, something systematic, et cetera, or do we understand this as something purely discursive, a cultural production, and so on? That kind of debate. And it seems to me that I keep falling back on the structural argument,
Hmm.
essentially, because otherwise we lose the nuance between prejudice, xenophobia, and racism,
Hmm.
right? Then what are we fighting? Am I fighting you because you don't happen to find me attractive as a Black woman, or am I fighting you because you're structurally oppressing me as a Black woman?
Hmm.
See? So I keep finding myself from a political and ideological perspective, always falling back on the structural. And I think there's a tension and a
Hmm.
contradiction in my work when it comes to that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dahlia. This brings up, we're a little bit over time, and I just want to, and Murad also wanted me to thank you on his behalf as well. And thank you for such a brilliant and thoughtful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you guys for inviting me. And yeah, my
Mm.
apologies for things being a little bit hectic in getting this together. But yeah, I would love to continue this conversation. Like I said, I think this is something we need to keep dealing with. Yeah.
I agree. I agree. Thank you so much, Dahlia.
Thanks,
Yes,
Samir. Thanks,
thank you
Iman.
all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. And just for everyone to know too, you'll be able to get the recording of this lecture on our YouTube, and you can also find it, you'll be able to find it on our website at bit.ly/Africana Muslim. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.